This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 963 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. The biggest hit for the sleepers last week was Rashad Bateman. He was the wide receiver 10 with 23 PPR points. Aaron Rodgers was a great streamer, and Cooper Rush, he was a top 10 option as well. Quentin Johnson was able to find the end zone. He had a 31% target share in that game against the Bucs. And then Demario Douglas, he was usable because he found the end zone too. But there were a good number of misses last week, as there always are. Tyler Algier didn't see the game script I wanted him to see. Bryce Young and Jameis Winston were the opposite of good streaming choices, though I did downgrade Jameis later in the week because of the weather in that game. The deep plays at running back didn't hit though, and neither did Sincere McCormick because of his injury. So it was probably a below average week last week. This is the last sleeper show of the season, given the holiday next week. So hopefully I go out on top. And just so you know, I do publish my rankings and tiers on Patreon, so you can see where I'm placing some lower rostered players in those rankings. I'll be doing them next week, despite this episode not happening. Now, before we get to the sleepers, I want to make sure that you're checking out Underdog. If your fantasy football season is over, or if you just want more action, head to Underdog right now. You can draft teams for playoff contests, and you don't need a huge bankroll to play. There's the Mitten, for instance. You can join that right now for $5. If you haven't played yet at Underdog, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. That'll get you a nice deposit offer once you get going. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. As usual, we'll kick things off with players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll start at quarterback. And I'm going to go back to Aaron Rodgers. Now, I don't feel as good about Rodgers this week as I did last week, but he's not in a terrible spot. There's some back and forth potential with the Jets facing the Rams. The Jets have an okay enough implied team total as well, close to 22 points. And LA has been the 11th best matchup for quarterbacks this year by adjusted points allowed. The Rams have been pretty good at getting pressure on quarterbacks this year, but Rodgers is good at not allowing that pressure to hit him, which could be an advantage to their passing attack. So he's probably the top streaming choice. Now, the other one that I have in this tier, definitely riskier, because he's facing a team that ranks as a bottom half opponent, but it's Drake May against Buffalo. This really comes down to hopefully having to keep pace with Josh Allen in this Bills offense. May has rushing juice, and if the Patriots hit a negative game script, there's going to be a higher chance for him to take off because he's going to have more dropbacks. He's given us almost 40 rushing yards per game in completed starts this year. May's put together back-to-back usable weeks with 19.4 and 17.5 standard fantasy points scored. It's definitely not an easy play to make, but I could see a path to him getting some easy points in this one. Now at running back, with Sincere McCormick now on IR, the Raiders are going to go back to Amir Abdullah and Alexander Mattison. That's their backfield. And they get Jacksonville this week, and the Jags are the third best matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. Now, I said this on the 15 transaction show, but I'd imagine a lot of people are going to be more attracted to Abdullah this week because he ended up scoring more points in week 15. But a lot of that was due to a negative game script. That might not happen this weekend against Jacksonville. They're actually home favorites against the Jags. Now, the game total, it's pretty low. We shouldn't expect a ton of scoring. With that being said, I do prefer Mattison because I think he's going to see the early down work. It's not like we haven't seen this backfield duo in the past. Mattison actually had a 4-game stretch earlier this year with a running back rush share per game rate of 80%. He's probably going to be the goal line back too. So both are in play, but Mattison is who I'd prefer. The Alvin Kamara injury needs to be monitored, but at the time of this recording, he seems more out than in this week. That leads to Kendre Miller, who would take on sort of a bell cow role in that offense. Now, the Saints get the Packers. Their team total is really low for obvious reasons. But I do think that Miller's kind of at an advantage here because his primary competition in the backfield is Jamal Williams. Williams isn't that much of a pass catcher. He has 9 targets this year. And in week 15, Miller not only played 20 more snaps than Williams, but he ran almost 4 times the number of routes. The Saints aren't projected to score that much, like I just said, but Miller could grab hold of a lot of touches in this backfield. That makes him a go-to sleeper. Now, the final running back that I have in this tier is Ray Davis. And the reason for that is game script. The Bills are 14.5 point favorites against the Patriots this week. They could grab hold of an early lead and lean on the run late in the game. Davis is coming off a game where he saw a 30% running back rush share, and the Patriots are the 7th best matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. That's why he's on the list. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit on today's show just to get more options at wide receiver. There just aren't that many in this 10 to 50% bucket. But one of them right above it is Christian Watson. Now, the fear with the Packers this weekend is that they just don't throw the ball a lot. They've been well under 0 and dropbacks over expected over their last 7 games, and they're huge favorites against the Saints. So one of the ways that the wide receivers can pay off is through big plays, right? If they're only going to see a handful of targets, hopefully those targets result in some big plays. Well, we know Christian Watson is that guy for the Packers. He has an ADOT over 18 yards this year. And the Saints are second in the NFL in percentage of throws against that go 15 or more air yards. So I would imagine that he gets a shot or two in this game to make a splash play. And that's something that some of you may need in your lineup this week. He's also hit target shares of 37% and 23% over his last 2. That doesn't hurt either. Jalen McMillan has now scored 3 touchdowns over his last 2 games. And while his touchdown scoring likely won't keep up, it's good to know that his usage has changed. He's seen his 2 highest target shares of the season over the last 2 weeks at 25% and 23%. And now the Bucs get the Cowboys in a game where their team total is 26 points. Dallas is the 10th best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed. So McMillan makes a lot of sense. Now in that same game is Brandon Cooks. He gets a Buccaneers defense that ranks 6th best for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed. He's also coming off a game where he ran a route on 93% of Dallas's dropbacks. That resulted in a 16% target share. So he's seeing okay usage, and he's in a plus matchup where the Cowboys have a respectable 22.5 point team total. So he's not a bad sleeper. And one last time, I'm going to go back to Demario Douglas. The Bills are one of 2 teams this year to have allowed a yards per route run rate to slot receivers north of 2. They also rank 2nd in adjusted target share allowed to the slot. As usual, Douglas doesn't have like a massive ceiling, more than likely. But in what should be a negative game script, I do think his PPR floor, it's respectable this week. And there's just one tight end for you in this tier, it's Brenton Strange. Strange had a 28% target share this past week. He had a similar route participation that we saw from Evan Ingram all season long. He basically just played the Evan Ingram role. Now, I doubt Mac Jones finishes the day against the Raiders with 46 pass attempts like he did last week against the Jets. But the Raiders are a top 7 matchup for tight ends by adjusted points allowed. I think Strange should have a floor of like 5 or 6 targets, and there's more of a ceiling if this game is just higher scoring than expected. This next tier of players includes guys rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. So for the last time this year, we're digging deeper. The first quarterback streamer in this tier is Cooper Rush. Rush came through last week in a plus matchup. It's an even better matchup this week on paper. Tampa Bay is the 2nd best matchup by adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. They're top 5 in adjusted passing yards allowed. Now, as I said with Brandon Cooks, the Dallas implied team total is not that bad. And Rush is averaging almost 16 points per game over his last 5. So he works. And I guess I got to shout out Michael Penix here too. This is really just a matchup thing. The Giants are an average team on paper in terms of adjusted points allowed, and they've been slightly below average in adjusted passing yards allowed. Atlanta currently is still sitting at a 25-point implied team total. I just don't know if this quarterback change is going to be this massive downgrade from a fantasy perspective. Kirk Cousins has not been playing well of late. And we know there are decent weapons surrounding Penix in this offense. So if you want to take a chance, I do think he's a high variance play with a little bit of upside. Now at running back, I'm going to go with Antonio Gibson. If game script goes south for New England this week, we might see more Gibson. He's played 44%, 23%, and 31% of New England snaps over his last 3. And he's run a route on 26% of their dropbacks during this time. If he finds the field in a negative game script, that could be meaningful because the Bills are first in the NFL in adjusted target share allowed to running backs. He's definitely more valuable in PPR formats, and he's definitely a deep league play. But I do think the logic is there. Now, as I said on the 15 transactions episode, I think Craig Reynolds is going to see like a 30% running back rush share this week. That's what we saw happen last year when David Montgomery was sidelined. I don't think we'll see a ton of receiving work, but we should anticipate Reynolds inching close to 10 touches against the Bears, especially if that game ends up favoring the Lions. And Chicago's beatable on the ground. They've allowed the 4th most adjusted points to running backs this year. So cross your fingers for a good game script if you use Reynolds. Now, at wide receiver, I think Jalen Coker is kind of obvious this week, at least as a sleeper. Arizona's not the best matchup in the world for wide receivers because they rank as a bottom 10 opponent in adjusted points allowed, but Xavier Leggette's banged up. Coker's coming off a game where he had a 22% target share. The last time we saw him before his injury, he had a 32% target share. He's getting looks in this offense, and there could be a lot of those going his way this week because of a potential negative game script as well as that Leggette injury. Trey Tucker has not been getting it done at all, but he's getting a ton of cardio. He's been running a lot of routes. He basically hasn't been below the 90% route share range since Davante Adams left town. And he does have a handful of games with a 20% target share too. The reason I'm calling him out this week is because the Raiders get the Jags. That's the 3rd best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed. And Jacksonville ranks 1st in adjusted passing yards allowed. So if you need a big play from a guy who's seen ADOTs of 15.8 and 14.0 over his last 2 games, Trey Tucker might be your guy. And then I'm going to go back to a guy that I talked about in the 15 Transaction Show earlier this week. That's Malik Washington. Jalen Waddle is trending in the wrong direction for this week's game. And Washington hit season highs in both target share and route share last week. He's likely going to get some slot work, but the Dolphins rotate their guys around. And San Francisco is actually not a bad slot matchup either. So in a game that has the potential for some scoring, I think Washington's kind of interesting. And then at tight end, there's one guy for you. It's Stone Smart. As long as Will Dissly's out, Smart's like a higher end to mid-range tight end too. He ran around on 70% of the Chargers dropbacks this past week. He was close to a 20% target share. Now, Denver's not the best matchup in the world, but that kind of usage is strong. That's why he's getting a shout. As for the defensive streamers this week, I think you can look at Cincinnati against Cleveland with Jameis Winston being benched, although Jameis Winston would have been a decent matchup too. And then Indianapolis against Tennessee, like I talked about earlier this week. Teams like Green Bay and Atlanta, I would call them out, but they're too high rostered now. Now, there aren't enough available underdog picks at the moment to give you some of my picks for the week. So that's it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly mailbag episode, and then there's another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll be in your ears then.